On the American frontier, there was no store to run to, no catalog to order from, no truck that delivered to the door. If a settler family needed something, they had two choices: make it themselves or grow it. And the truly remarkable thing is how many of the things we buy today, they simply grew right outside the cabin door. The settlers had a different way of looking at a plant than we do. We ask, what is this one thing good for? They asked, how many things can this single plant do for my family? And the plants they chose to grow on purpose, in the precious space around their homes, were the ones that answered that question best. The hardest working plants of all. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the settlers grew instead of buying everything they needed. Plants that fed them, healed them, protected them, clothed them, and more, very often all at the very same time. And number 5 is a single plant that gave a settler family food, drink, medicine in the old traditions, and even material for the home, all from one humble corner of the garden. Think about what that truly meant. Every bit of ground around a settler's cabin had to earn its keep and earn it many times over. There was no room for a plant that did only one small job. The plants that survived in the settler garden were the multitaskers, the ones that paid their rent in 3 or 4 different ways. To the settlers, these were not just plants. They were tools, pantries, and medicine chests, all rolled into living green things. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old fading knowledge. It is not medical advice, and it is not foraging advice. Many plants have dangerous look-alikes, and you should never eat or use any wild plant without expert identification. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who turned a patch of raw ground into a home that provided very nearly everything they needed to live. To understand the settler garden, you have to forget the way we garden today. We grow tomatoes in one bed, flowers in another, herbs in a pot by the door, each plant kept in its place, each grown for one purpose. The settler garden was nothing like that. It was a dense, practical, working space where every plant was chosen because it pulled its weight in many ways at once. A settler could not afford a plant that was merely pretty, but if a plant was pretty and also kept the bugs off the cabbages and also could be dried for the winter and also soothed a child's scrape in the old tradition, well, that plant earned a place of honor. This was gardening as survival, gardening as self-reliance, gardening as the difference between a family that thrived and a family that struggled. Much of this knowledge came from the old country, and much was learned from the native peoples who had farmed and gathered on this land for thousands of years. Together it became the practical wisdom of the American homestead, and like so much of it, it faded as we moved to cities and bought our way out of needing to know. Today we remember it, beginning with the first plant, and as we go, notice the pattern that runs through every one of these plants. Not one of them was a specialist, grown for a single narrow purpose. Each was a generalist, a jack of all trades, giving the family 3, 4, or 5 different gifts from one planting. That was the iron logic of the frontier garden, where space was scarce, time was short, and a plant had to truly earn its place in the soil. This is the forgotten art of growing more from less. Number 1. Flax. To us, flax is an obscure little plant, if we have heard of it at all. To the settlers, flax was one of the most important plants they grew. Because flax did something almost no other garden plant could. It clothed the family. From this single slender plant with its pretty blue flowers came linen, the very cloth that made their shirts, their sheets, their towels, and their sacks. Turning flax into cloth was a long and skilled process. One filled the quiet winter months. The stalks were soaked, dried, beaten, and combed until the long fibers came free, and then those fibers were spun into thread, and woven into linen on the home loom. A field of flax in summer meant clothing and linens for the family through the years to come. It was, quite literally, a crop you could wear. But flax did not stop at cloth. The seeds of the plant, flaxseed or linseed, were valuable in their own right. They were used as food, rich and nourishing, and pressed for their oil, which had countless uses around the home, from finishing wood to other practical needs. In the old traditions, flaxseed was also valued for the body, used in the gentlefolk belief that it soothed and helped the system, though as always, I share this only as history. Think of what a single planting of flax gave a settler family: cloth for their backs, seed for their table, and oil for the home. One plant standing in for the entire clothing store, part of the grocery, and part of the hardware store, all at once. No wonder the settlers prized it so. The next plant fed not just the family, but the whole homestead. And here is a detail that shows how completely the settlers depended on it. A bride on the frontier often counted her worth in linen, in the sheets and the cloth she had spun and woven with her own hands from the flax of the family field. Linen was not bought. It was grown, gathered, and made through long, patient months of work, beginning with a handful of small seeds and a sunny patch of ground. To plant flax was to plant the very clothes on your children's backs. Number 2, corn. Corn or maize was the great gift of the native peoples to the settlers, and it became the beating heart of the homestead. We think of corn as just food, and sweet corn on the cob at that. But to the settlers, corn was a plant of astonishing usefulness, where almost nothing was ever wasted. The kernels, of course, were the main prize. Dried hard, corn could be stored for a very long time and ground into cornmeal, the foundation of countless frontier meals, from cornbread to porridge to the humble staples that kept a family fed through winter. It fed the people, and it fed the livestock too, the pigs and the chickens and the cattle that the family depended on. But look at the rest of the plant. The dried husks were woven into mats, braided into cords, twisted into corn husk dolls for the children, and even used to stuff mattresses. The dried cobs, once the kernels were gone, made excellent fuel for the fire and had many humble uses around the privy and the home. The stalks fed the animals. Almost every single part of the corn plant found a job. This was the settler way distilled into one plant. Corn was food for people, feed for animals, material for crafts and bedding, and fuel for the fire. A family could plant a field of corn and harvest not just a meal, but a whole web of materials that touched every part of daily life. The next plant was the settler's living fence and so much more. And corn shaped the very rhythm of the homestead year. The spring planting, the summer tending, the autumn harvest, the long winter evenings of shelling the dried ears by the fire. All of it turned around this one great plant. Children learned to work by husking corn. Neighbors gathered to help at harvest. The corn was not only food and material, it was woven into the very life and community of the frontier. And the settlers learned the deepest secret of the corn from the native peoples, who had bred and tended it for countless generations. They learned not only how to grow it, but how to store it, how to grind it, and how to prepare it so that it nourished the body fully. This was knowledge given freely from one people to another, and without it, many a settler family would never have survived their first hard winters in the new land. The corn was a gift in every sense. Number 3, sunflower. The tall, bright, cheerful sunflower seems today like a purely decorative plant, something we grow to make the garden smile. The settlers and the native peoples before them saw a towering workhorse of remarkable usefulness, standing head and shoulders above the rest of the garden. The seeds were the obvious treasure. Nutritious and rich, sunflower seeds were eaten as food, and they were pressed for their oil, a valuable cooking and lamp oil on a frontier where every drop of fat and oil mattered. The seeds also fed the chickens and other livestock, and they drew helpful birds to the garden. A single great sunflower head held a small harvest all on its own. But the sunflower gave more than seed. Its tall, sturdy stalks were used as light building material, as stakes, and as fuel. The bright flowers yielded a yellow dye for coloring cloth, and planted in rows, those tall, thick stalks formed a natural windbreak and a living screen, sheltering more delicate plants and marking boundaries. The settlers even followed the native practice of planting them at the edges of fields. So the humble sunflower was food, oil, animal feed, dye, building material, and living fence, all in one bright, nodding plant. It asked for almost nothing, grew quickly and tall, and gave back in half a dozen different ways. That was exactly the kind of generous, hard-working plant the settlers built their gardens around. The next plant was grown in nearly every dooryard for more reasons than you would guess. And there was a quiet beauty in it, too, that the settlers surely felt even if they rarely spoke of it. A row of tall sunflowers, their great golden heads, all turned to follow the sun across the sky, brought a lift to the heart at the end of a hard day's labor. A plant that fed the body, served the home, and gladdened the spirit, all at once was a true companion on the lonely frontier. The settlers grew them by the cabin where they could be seen and enjoyed. Number 4. Gourds. Long before the settlers could buy a single bowl, jug, or dipper, they grew them, hanging right on the vine. The hard-shelled gourd was one of the most ingenious plants in the settler garden because when it dried, its tough woody shell became a ready-made container, free for the growing. Settler families grew gourds and let them dry hard on the vine or in the barn, and then put them to 100 uses. The classic was the dipper gourd, with its long handle and round bowl, used to scoop water from the bucket or the well, a tool found by nearly every frontier water barrel. Larger gourds became bowls, storage containers, and jugs for seeds and dry goods. Birdhouse gourds were hung up to invite helpful birds like purple martins, which ate troublesome insects. And some gourds, harvested young and tender, were eaten as food, cooked like squash, which is exactly what they are. So the gourd fed the family when young and served the household when old and dried. From one sprawling vine came food and a whole shelf of free kitchenware that would have cost dearly to buy if it could be bought at all. And the children of the homestead loved the gourds especially, for among all the practical dippers and bowls, there were always a few grown simply for delight. A small gourd could become a rattle or a toy, a birdhouse to watch through the summer, or, with a bit of carving, a simple musical instrument. In a life with few bought playthings, the garden itself provided growing wonder and usefulness side by side on the same humble vine. This is such a perfect picture of settler ingenuity. Why buy a bowl when you can grow one? Why purchase a dipper when the garden makes them by the dozen? The gourd let a poor family fill their home with useful vessels at the cost of a few seeds and a season's sun. The next plant was the single most versatile of them all. And the gourd traveled well through time, for a properly dried and cured gourd vessel could last for many years of daily use, hardening almost like wood. A single good season of gourds might furnish a cabin with dippers, bowls, and storage vessels that served the family for a decade or more. In a world where every manufactured object was dear and hard to come by, this was a quiet kind of wealth, grown freely from the soil. And now we reach number 5. The one I promised you. A single plant that gave a settler family food, drink, the old traditional remedies, and material for the home, all from one sprawling corner of the garden. Number 5. The pumpkin and its cousins, the winter squash. The pumpkin was a cornerstone of frontier survival, and one of the most generous plants the settlers grew. Big, hardy, and astonishingly long-keeping, a good pumpkin or winter squash could be stored through much of the winter without any special effort, a reliable source of food when the cold months closed in. The flesh was the heart of it, of course. Roasted, boiled, baked into the famous pies, dried into strips for long storage, or cooked into countless dishes, pumpkin-filled bellies all winter long. But that was only the beginning. The seeds were roasted and eaten, nutritious and delicious. And in the old folk traditions, the seeds were also valued for the body, though again I share that only as history. The settlers wasted nothing of this great fruit. Even the shell had its uses. Hollowed and dried, smaller hard squashes served as containers. The flesh was fed to the livestock as well, fattening the animals on what the family could not eat. And pumpkins were sometimes used in the making of frontier beers and other drinks, a bit of sweetness and substance on a frontier short on both. Food, drink, animal feed, old-time remedy, and container, all from one trailing vine. This was why the settlers planted pumpkins so faithfully, often right among the corn. A few seeds gave a sprawling vine that fed the family for months, fed the animals, and gave drink and container besides. Few plants captured the whole spirit of settler gardening so completely. Get the most from the least. The next plant brought the sweetness to the homestead, and the pumpkin held a special place in the heart of the frontier autumn, for its harvest marked the turning of the year toward winter and the gathering in of the season's bounty. A cellar lined with golden pumpkins and winter squash was a deeply reassuring sight to a settler family, a visible promise that there would be food on the table through the cold, dark months ahead. Few sights spoke so plainly of security and plenty, and the pumpkin had one more great virtue that made it beloved on the frontier. It practically grew itself. Tucked among the corn, given a little sun and rain, the sprawling vines would ramble across the ground and produce their heavy fruits with very little tending while the family attended to 100 other urgent chores. A crop that fed you for months and asked almost nothing of your scarce time and labor was worth its weight in gold to a settler. Number 6. Comfrey. Comfrey is a large, leafy plant with rough leaves and pretty drooping bell-shaped flowers, and it was one of the most valued working plants of the old homestead. Even though you could not really eat it, its value lay in all the other jobs it did, quietly and tirelessly, around the garden and the farm. In the old folk traditions, comfrey was one of the most famous of all the healing plants, used on the outside of the body for bruises, sprains, and aches. So well known for this that it carried old country names tied to mending and knitting bones. I share this strictly as history and tradition, never as advice, for comfrey is a plant to be treated with real caution and knowledge. But its reputation in the old herbal tradition was enormous, and settler families valued it greatly. Beyond the old remedies, comfrey was a treasure for the garden and the animals. Its deep roots pulled up nutrients from far below, and its lush leaves cut and laid on the soil or composted made one of the finest natural fertilizers a settler could ask for, feeding the vegetable beds for free. The leaves were also fed to livestock as nourishing fodder. It grew vigorously, came back faithfully year after year, and asked for nothing. So comfrey was a fertilizer factory, an animal fodder, and a cornerstone of the old healing traditions, all in one tough, generous plant tucked in the corner of the garden. It is a perfect example of a plant that earns its place not on the dinner plate, but through all the other work it quietly does. The final plant tied the whole garden together and sweetened it too, and comfrey reminds us that the settler garden was full of plants that never reached the dinner table at all, yet were treasured all the same. We tend to value a plant only by what we can eat of it. The settlers knew better. They valued a plant by everything it could do, and a plant like comfrey, which fed the soil, the animals, and the old remedies, was as precious in its own way as any vegetable in the bed. And the settlers prized comfrey, especially because it was so utterly self-sufficient and so generous in its giving. Plant it once, in a forgotten corner, and it would return faithfully every spring for many years, growing lush and tall with no care at all, ready to be cut again and again through the season for the compost heap, the animal trough, or the old healing traditions. Few plants gave so much for so little, year after faithful year. Number 7. Beans. We end with one of the humblest and most essential plants of the entire settler garden, the bean. Alongside corn and squash, the bean completed the famous trio the native peoples called the Three Sisters, and it was a quiet powerhouse of usefulness in its own right. As food, beans were beyond precious. Dried, they stored almost indefinitely, packing protein and nourishment into a small, light, lasting package, exactly what a family needed to survive the long winter and the lean times. A barrel of dried beans was a barrel of security against hunger. They could be cooked 100 ways and stretched a meal further than almost anything else in the pantry. But the bean did something invisible and remarkable as well. Beans, like all their family, feed the soil itself, drawing nourishment from the air and leaving the ground richer than they found it. The settlers, following the wisdom of the native peoples, planted beans among the corn, where the bean vines climbed the corn stalks like a living trellis. The squash sprawled below to shade the soil, and the beans quietly fed the earth that fed them all. 3 plants working as one. So the bean was food for today, stored security for tomorrow, a climber that needed no built trellis, and a quiet feeder of the very soil. It asked little and gave much in ways both seen and unseen. It is the perfect plant to end on because it shows the deepest settler wisdom of all. The best plants do not just take from the land, they give back to it. And so the humble bean carries the deepest lesson of this whole garden. The settlers, for all their hardship, understood that true self-reliance was not about taking everything you could from the land as fast as possible. It was about working with the land so that it stayed rich and giving, year after year, for your children and your children's children. The bean, quietly feeding the very soil it grew in, was a small daily teacher of that great and lasting wisdom. And there is a lesson in that partnership of corn, beans, and squash that runs deeper than gardening. The 3 plants together gave more than any one of them could alone. The corn gave the bean its ladder, the bean gave the soil its richness, and the squash gave the ground its cool shade and kept the weeds away. The settlers, learning this from the native peoples, saw in it a kind of wisdom about how living things might support one another, each giving what it had, each receiving what it needed. So there you have it. 7 plants the settlers grew instead of buying everything they needed. Flax, the plant you could wear. Corn, the heart of the homestead, useful root to tip. Sunflower, the towering workhorse of seed, oil, and dye. Gourds, the kitchenware that grew on the vine. Pumpkin, the generous giver of food, drink, and more. Comfrey, the quiet healer and feeder of the garden. And beans, the humble protein that fed both family and soil. Every one of them did the work of several plants at once, and together they did the work of a whole row of stores we depend on today. The settlers did not have much money. What they had was knowledge and a patch of ground and plants that worked as hard as they did. From those simple things, they built a life that provided very nearly everything. And perhaps that is the real treasure the settlers left us. Not the list of plants itself, but the way of seeing that lies behind it. They looked at the green world around them and saw not decoration, not nuisance, not single uses, but possibility upon possibility, gift upon gift, in every leaf and root and seed. If we could learn to look at our own gardens and yards with even a fraction of that attention, we might find that the land is far more generous and we far more capable than we ever imagined. And these 7 are only part of the settlers' working garden. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full picture of how the pioneers grew their own food, medicine, materials, and protection, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Self-Reliant Settler Garden. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one, because among all the jobs these plants did, one was a constant battle on every homestead, keeping the bugs and pests off the precious crops without a single chemical. Next, I want to show you the plants the settlers grew to protect their crops from insects and pests, the green guardians of the garden. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.